guys, I apologize for sound weirdness. I have a slight cold. I also had to do some editing to remove some really racist games that kids were said to play on Earth. Enjoy! Sin in Space, Chapter 9. Tony got 4 hours sleep before Tad Campbell came banging on his door at 3:15 a.m. The boy's enthusiasm was more than Tony could face. It would be easier to carry his own equipment than to answer questions while he was dressing. He sent Tad to wait at the plane and put some coffee on to brew, then did a last quick check of his portable health lab, making sure that there was nothing overlooked in the hasty preparations after the news about the Earthship. Gulping down the hot brew, he reviewed the instructions he'd given Anna. Feedings for Sonny Candro, Baccy-Tracin for Dorothy, ointment and dressings for Joan, another injection if she needed it, and under no circumstances sedative for Mrs. Biles. He couldn't think of anything predictable he'd failed to provide for. He folded the lab to make a large carrying case and lugged his burden up the gentle slope that led to the landing field where Lazy Girl, the colony's transport plane, waited. B. Juarez was warming the icy motors with a blowtorch. The girl nodded to him, ran a hand over the moisture condensing on the metallic surface, and applied the torch to a new spot. She shook her head doubtfully. "Don't blame me if she falls apart in midair after we take off. I put her together with spit overnight, Tony. She was scattered all over the field for a 100-hour check. You'd think they'd let you know." She grumbled, then broke off and grinned. "What the hell, if we blow up halfway between here and there, we don't have to worry about the Marcane anymore. Climb aboard, Doc." She snapped off the torch. "Hey, Tad, the Doc needs a hand with his contraption." Tony felt a twinge of conscience as Tad hopped out of the plane and ran to take the big box. It must have been a blow to the boy to be deprived of carrying the heavy equipment from the hospital. "How's it going?" Tony asked genially. "You seem to be getting along fine without your tailbone." "Okay," the boy grunted. He eased the box into the cabin, pulled it out of the way, and reached down a condescending hand to help Tony. "It don't seem to matter," he added, when the doctor was inside. "You'll never know it wasn't there." Tad was the recent victim of an unhappily humorous accident. Butted in the seat by an angry goat, he had had his coccyx severely fractured, and the doctor had had to remove the caudal vertebrae. It probably qualified, Tony thought, as another of those history-making occasions. The colony's first spinal, if you want to stretch the term, operation. Historic or not, it was a permanent bond between the boy and the doctor, the only one who had been able to take it seriously. Tony patted a couple of spare parkas into the comfortable couch on the cabin floor and stretched out. The plane had no seats. Coming back, they'd sit on the bare floor, and the parkas would have another use. The ship was unheated, and the newcomers weren't likely to have warm clothes unpacked. Lazy Girl was short on comfort and speed, cannibalized on Mars from the scrapped remains of obsolete models discarded by wealthier colonies. Tony, who didn't fly himself, had been told that she handled easily and flew an immense payload without complaining. Tad had built himself a luxurious nest of parkas. He pulled the last one up around his shivering shoulders, leaned back, and examined the interior of the plane with a good imitation of a practiced appraisal. "Nice job," he pronounced finally. "You don't get them like this back on Earth." "You sure don't," B agreed with him ironically from the pilot's seat. "Hold on to your hat, here we go." Say what you like about Mars, about the colony, and about the poor old relic of a plane, Tony thought. When you took a look at the kids, you began to understand what it was all about. A year ago, Tad had been a thoroughly obnoxious brat, but how could he be anything else on Earth? They were all that way. You got born into a hate thy neighbor, envy thy neighbor, murder thy neighbor culture. In your infancy, your overworked and underfed mother's breast was always withdrawn too soon, and you were filled again and again, day after day, with blind and squalling rage. You were a toddler, and you snatched at another one's bit of candy. You were hungry, and you hated him. You fought him. You learned big boys' games. Extermination camp, loot the city. The odds were you were hungry, always hungry. Naked dictatorship and leader worship, oligarchy and dollar worship. Sometimes one was worse, sometimes the other. The forms didn't matter, the facts did. Too many mouths, not enough topsoil. Middle classes with their relatively stable, relatively sane families were growing smaller and being ground out of existence as still more black dirt washed into the ocean, and still more hungry mouths were born and prices went higher and higher. How long, in God's name, could it go on? How long before it blew up? Not figuratively speaking either. The Pan-American World Federation, first with the most, refused to tolerate the production of mass destruction weapons anywhere else in the world. Long calloused to foreign mutterings, the Western Colossus would at irregular intervals fire off a guided missile on the advice of one of its swarm of intelligence agents. In Tartary or France or Zanzibar, then, an innocent-looking structure would go up in a smoke mushroom. But they never stopped trying, and someday Tartary or France or Zanzibar would launch a missile of its own, and it would mean nothing less than the end of the world in fire and plague as the rocket trails laced continents together and the bombers rained botulism, radiocobalt, and flasks of tritium with bikinis in their cores. The damned poverty-ridden, swarming earth. Short of food, short of soil, short of water, short of metals, short of everything except vicious, universal resentments and aggressions bred by their other shortages. That's what they were running from, the new arrivals he was going to meet today. He hoped there wouldn't be any more communicable disease carriers to quarantine at Marsport and fire back on the return trip without even a look around. There were supposed to be 6 medical examiners between the first application filed at the Sun Lake Society office in New York and the embarkation, but things must have got appreciably worse on Earth since. He started a little at the thought. Since his time. It seemed that now anybody could be reached. They used to say everybody had his price. Maybe it was true. He'd never had a chance to turn down a really big bribe, so he couldn't say. But if 6 boards of doctors could all be fixed, everybody's price must have taken a drastic slump. Tad, sound asleep, rolled onto his stomach and humped up his behind, scene of the history-making operation, in a brief reversion to infancy. "How come the rocket's getting in early?" Bea called back. "I didn't even have time to ask Harv about it last night, with the girls spread out all over the field." "Something about the throat liner. They have a new remote control servicing apparatus on Earth," Tony said. "Gets the liner out and cleaned it in faster. We save 2 weeks on each trip and get an extra trip. What is it, every 2 years?" "1.5 years, Bea corrected. She was silent a moment, then snorted. "Rockets." "At least," Tony deadpanned. "Rockets give you a smooth ride. Fat chance of getting any sleep in this pile." "The girl never gave you a rough trip in your life," she interrupted angrily. She pulled on the stick and swung the girl downwind. The doctor drowsily studied her, silhouetted against the stars through the windshield. She was attached to the old crate. Ought to find herself a husband. It had looked like her and Flexner for a while, but then the chemist had paired off with Verna Blau. As the motor warmed up, Bea unzipped her parka and shrugged out of it. Definitely, Tony decided, the best shape in Sun Lake. Trim, fine down, athletic, but no doubt at all, from this angle, that the figure was feminine, even under the bulky sweater she still wore. He lay back on his improvised couch and reflected on how pleasant it would be to stand behind her and run his hands down over her shoulders. Infinitely pleasant, just to stand behind her while she flew the ship. Pleasant, but impractical. Play hell with her estimated time of arrival at Marsport, for one thing, and, to take a longer view, he probably would end up by marrying her. Her and Lazy Girl. The two went together. Still, it was pleasant to undress her in his mind. A twist and a wriggle, and her sweater was over her head, her face coming up, smiling and ready. Zip, her fitted slacks divided neatly and fell away. She wore... Tony stretched and considered. She would wear something black and frilly as undergarments, he decided. Shadowy enough to make a mystery, filmy enough to reveal intimate treasures. There would probably be hooks or more zippers. Hooks would be better. Unhook the hooks, and... He stirred uncomfortably. While he was thinking idly goatish things about Bea, Anna had turned up in his mind, with a half-smile on her face. It was typical, he thought, puzzled. Anna never intruded until the moment you wanted her. If you wanted her, he added unhappily, giving the verb a new meaning. Anna's smile was a tingling mystery. Her dark eyes were wells of warmth in which a man could lose himself. But after all these months, he wasn't sure of their color. And even when she crept into his mind, it was only from the neck up that he visualized her. That wasn't the way he saw Bea. Tony shook himself, stretched out, and let his eyes linger on the girl in the pilot's seat, until he fell asleep. The sun was up when Bea eased the freighter in among more planes than they'd ever seen before on arrival day. They recognized the elegant staff carrier from Sun Lake's neighbor, Pitco 3, but didn't know the other 12 that were parked. "Swell ride, Bea," said the doctor. "Now what is this dress parade all about?" "Oh, sure, Douglas Graham is going to Gunth Mars. These should be the big shots from the commercial colonies." "I hate these damn superficial Gunthers," Bea said fiercely. "Is it going to bother Sun Lake?" Nick thinks he might zip through at the end of his tour if he has time. He hopped to the ground, Tad following with the boxed lab. "You got the shopping list, B?" the doctor asked. "I have to go over to the ad building. Don't think I'll have time for anything else. Can you get all the stuff?" "Sure," she said easily. "We're not buying much this time." Tony ignored the bitter significance of the remark. "We'll see you later, then. I hope this red carpet business for Graham doesn't slow things up too much. I'd like to get back before lunch." Tony was fidgeting next to him, waiting for a chance to break in. A year ago, the boy had spent 2 days in Marsport, when he arrived with his family and the other founding members of the colony. There had been nothing more than a pitying sneer for the village of 600 people. Now it was a place of wonder. "Dr. Tony," he asked eagerly, "can we go to the arcade?" "We can go through it," Tony decided. The arcade was Aladdin's cave to Tad. To the Planetary Affairs Commission, which rented out booth space in the ramshackle building, it was a source of revenue. To Tony, it was the stronghold of the irrepressible small retailer, who found his way even to Mars with articles he could buy cheap and sell dear, a reminder of the extent to which Mars was already taking over the social and economic patterns of Earth. Booths at the arcade did not display radiation counters, hand tools, welders, rope, radio, aluminum I-beams, airplane parts, or half-tracks. Those you bought at the PAC stores, which were reliable, conservative, and dull. At the arcade, there was one booth which sold nothing but coffee in the cup. Martian, $2. Earthside, $15, with sugar, $25. Tony knew the privateer who ran this concession might be ruined by another arrival aboard today's rocket, landing in paper-like clothes with his garment and personal luggage allowance taken up by bricks of Earthside coffee and sugar, burning to undercut the highwayman who'd beaten him to the happy hunting grounds of Mars. Another booth, the most beautiful collie, boxer, and English shepherd pups were for sale at the astounding price of only $20 each. The catch was that the proprietor of this booth was the only merchant on Mars with a stock of dog food. At another booth, Tad's jaw dropped with perplexity. "Dr. Tony, what are those?" he asked. "Underwear, Tad, for women." "But don't they get cold in those things?" "Well, they would if they went out and worked like our women, but, well, for instance in Pitco, over the Rimrock Hills from us, there are some ladies who only work indoors, where it's heated." "All heated? Not just beam heat on the beds and things?" "I'm afraid I don't really know. Say, look at those boots there. Aren't they something?" "Boy!" The boots were mere shiny zipper jobs. "What I wouldn't give for a pair of those. Pull 'em on when new kids come in, and then watch 'em try and walk around in earth sandals and get a load of that sand." Here on Mars, the price put the boots infinitely far out of reach from a boy like Tad, even if Sun Lake's policies did not prevent the purchase of such an item. Some supervisor in an industrial colony, Tony thought, would eventually acquire them as an illusion of escape from the sands of Mars. And that reminded him. He turned to Tad. "By the way, what do you know about kids going barefoot around the colony? When did that start?" "Barefoot?" Tad looked outraged. "What do you think we are, dopes?" "I think," Tony answered dryly, "that anybody who'd go strolling around the Rimrock Caves without boots on is about as much of a jackass as he can be." "In the caves?" This time Tony thought he detected a note of more honest horror. All the kids went barefoot sometimes in the experimental fields. Everybody knew about it and pretended not to. The kids were pretty careful about not stepping on marked planted rows, and the fields had been processed to remove native poison salts from the soil. "Listen, Dr. Tony," Tad said earnestly. "If any of the kids are doing that, I'll put a stop to it. They ought to know better. You remember that time you had to fix my hand before the, other thing, when I just thought I'd pick up a piece of rock and it practically sliced my finger off. They shouldn't be walking barefoot around there." "I remember," Tony smiled. "Sliced your finger off is a slight exaggeration, but I wouldn't like to have to handle a mess of feet like that. If you know who's doing it, you tell them I said to cut it out, or they may not be walking at all after a while." "I'll let them know." Tad walked along silently, ignoring the bright displays as they passed, and Tony seized the chance to direct their footsteps out of the arcade. "Dr. Tony," the boy said finally, "you didn't mean for me to tell you who it was in case I knew, did you?" Lord, no. The doctor had been hoping to find out, but he realized now what an error he'd almost made. A year ago, Tad had been as miserable a little snitch and talebearer as Earth could produce. I just want it stopped, that's all. Okay, then. Tad's face relaxed into a friendly grin. It will be. We've got to keep going, the doctor thought. For himself, for the other adults, it didn't matter so much. But for the kids... Tony had absolutely no respect for Naughton, the PAC medical officer, because Naughton was stupid. Fortunately, Naughton was so stupid that he didn't realize this and greeted the Sun Lake medic joyfully. Here you been up to tricks, boy. Why didn't you come to me instead? I got ways to get Marcane. Glad to hear it, and I'll bet you do. While we were stealing that Marcane, we also had a baby. Got the form? Corporal, yelled Naughton. Birth form. A non-com produced the piece of official paper, and Tony filled it in, checking weight and other data with notes in his pocket. That hot pilot of yours still around? Asked Naughton. Bea Juarez? Sure. Interested? Just tell her that her plane's a disgusting old wreck, and you'll get her a new one. She always falls for that line. No kidding? Who'd kid you, Naughton? Say, is Ed Neely anywhere? In the signal room. Where's Juarez, did you say? I'll see you, Naughton. Tony hurried off. He found the lieutenant reading a medical journal which had passed through his own hands months earlier on its way around the joint subscription club, of which both men were members. The club made it possible for them, in common with 20-odd fellow members on Mars, to keep up with technical and scientific publications without paying ruinous amounts in interplanetary postage. Hello, Ed. Neely put out his hand. I didn't know whether you'd still be talking to me, Tony. Hell, you didn't give the orders. You have to play it the way Bell calls it. Ed, off the record. You're pretty sure it was one of our people? All I'm sure of, it wasn't a phony. To qualify with the Bloodhound on Earth, we had to follow made trails, where they drag bags of aniseed over the spore. You can tell the difference. This one faded and wobbled like the real thing. And we lost it, not more than a couple of miles out of your place, headed straight your way. Tony, have you searched? Some. We're not done yet. The doctor lowered his voice. What's the matter with Commissioner Bell, Ed? Does he have anything special against us? The lieutenant jerked his chin a little at the PFC, sitting with earphones on his head, reading a comic book, and led the doctor into the corridor. God, what a post, he said. Tony, all I know is that Bell's a lost soul outside the Insurrectionist Party's inner circle. He had 15 years of being looked up to as the grand old man of the Mexicali Foreign Arizonian Insurrectionists, and now he's been booted to Mars. He'll do anything, I believe, to get back into the party. And don't forget that Brenner has been a heavy contributor to the Insurrectist campaign funds during the last 3 elections. You know I'm professional military, and I'm not supposed to and don't want to have anything to do with politics. Commissioner Bell came stumping down the corridor. Lieutenant Neely, he interrupted. Neely came to as casual an attitude of attention as his years of drilling would allow. Surely you have better things to do with your time than plavering with persons suspected of harboring criminals. Dr. Hellman is my friend, sir. Very interesting. I suggest you go on about your duties and pick your friends more discriminatingly. Whatever you say, sir. With slow deliberation, the lieutenant turned and shook Tony's hand. I'm on duty now, he said tightly. I'll see you around. So long, kid. He put his hand on Tad's shoulder, wheeled about smartly, and turned back into the signal room. Come on, Tad, said the doctor. We're all done here. We might as well get out to the rocket field.